When you're solving a two-step equation, the first thing that you always do is undo the addition or subtraction. So you can see here in our example that we have addition. So the first thing we do is we undo the addition. Now if this was subtraction, the first thing that we do is undo the subtraction. So to undo the addition, we do the opposite. So since I have a plus 5, I need to subtract 5 from both sides. So when I subtract 5 from both sides, I plus 5 and minus 5 equals 0, so that's crossed off, and I'm simply left with a negative 3x, carried that down, and now I have 2 minus 5, and that leaves me with a negative 3. So the next thing I do is I undo the multiplication. So remember, my second step is always undo the multiplication or the division. To undo the multiplication, I have to divide, because that's the opposite. So I divide this side by negative 3. That means I also have to divide this side by negative 3. So negative 3 divided by negative 3 is 1, so I'm simply left with x. And then on this side, we also have negative 3 divided by negative 3, and I'm simply left with 1, because we have two negatives here that we're dividing, so that means my answer is positive. The last thing I do is check my solution. To check my solution, I simply plug in my answer into my original equation and see if I get the right answer. Okay, so I have substituted x for 1 because I said x equals 1. So I have negative 3 times 1, and negative 3 times 1 is negative 3. And I have my plus 5. Negative 3 plus 5 equals 2. Is that correct? Yes. So I know that I did it right. Booyah, Grandma. Okay, so remember, always I undo the subtraction or addition first. In this problem, you can see that I have subtraction, so the first thing I need to do to undo it is add 1/2 to both sides. So I've added 1/2 to both sides, and you can see here that when I add 1/2 to both sides, this is now deleted, and negative 7/2 plus 1/2. If you don't have a great grasp of your fractions, remember you can always just add it in your calculator. So negative 1/2 plus 1/2 is equal to negative 3. So I'm simply left with x divided by 8 equals negative 3. My next step is to undo the division. Okay, so to undo the division, I have to do the opposite, which is multiply. So I multiply both sides by 8. Since I multiplied both sides by 8, this is crossed off, and I'm simply left with x equals negative 24, because negative 3 times 8 equals negative 24. And then last step is I always check my solution by plugging in my answer back into the original equation. Okay, so I plug 24 in for x, so negative 24 minus 1/2 equals negative 1/2. If I subtract 1/2 from negative 24, it equals negative 7/2. Is that the answer I'm supposed to have? Yes, I know I did it right. Okay, so I'm going to have you try one more type of problem. You can add this into your notes somewhere else or on a blank piece of paper. And let's say I have 1/2 z, plus, that's a beautiful plus sign, 2 equals 4. First thing I always do is I undo my subtraction or addition, so I have plus 2, so I'm going to subtract 2 from both sides. And now I'm left with 1/2 z is equal to 4 minus 2 is 2. Now, because I have this 1/2 z, sometimes people think this fraction part's kind of confusing. 1/2 z means 1/2 times z. So I have to do the opposite, which is dividing. Now this is tricky. When I divide a fraction, I'm actually multiplying by its reciprocal. So if you see 1/2 z or a fraction right next to a variable, you have to multiply by its reciprocal to get rid of the number part so you can find out the value of the variable. So I go ahead and I multiply by my reciprocal. on both sides. So 1/2 times 2/1 times 1/2 equals 1. So I'm left with z equals, what's 2 times 2/1? That equals 4. So my answer would be z equals 4. If you have a problem with more than one variable or more than one term that has the same variable, you have to combine your like terms. So you have to combine your like terms before you can solve. So if you look at this problem, you can see that I have 3y minus 8y equals 25. These have the same variable to the same power, so I would combine them. 3y minus 8y is going to give me negative 5y equals 25. Now, I only have one operation here, and that's negative 5 times y, so I have to undo my multiplication. So I'm going to divide both sides by negative 5. Negative 5y equals 25. So I divide both sides by negative 5. And I am left with y equals negative 5. Because 25 divided by negative 5 is equal to negative 5. My last step always is to check my solution. So I would go ahead and I would plug negative 5 in for both y's and see if it equaled 25. It does, so I'm not going to do it this time. Okay, and here is your last problem for your notes, and this is a real world problem, which is the most important thing. What's the point of learning this stuff if you can't apply it into the actual world? So pay attention closely. We can see, first of all, read the problem. The height at the top of a roller coaster is 10 times the height h of the starting point. The height decreases by 100 feet from the top to the bottom of the hill. The height at the bottom of the hill is negative 10 feet. Find h. So I look at my picture and I can see that this top, they said, is 10 times what it was at the bottom. And this total is 100 feet. So the first thing I need to first thing I have to do is define my variable. So it says to find h, so I know that h is my variable. And h represents height. Okay, next I need to set up my equation. And I'm going to look right here, and I can see that it says the top is 10 times the height. So I know that the top is 10h because it's 10 times the height of the starting point. The height decreases by 100 feet, and at the bottom it is negative 10 feet. So I'm going to go ahead and use my clue words. So it's 10 times the height. So I know that this is 10h. Now the height decreases by 100 feet. So if it's decreasing, it's going down. So I'm going to subtract 100. And then the last thing it says is negative 10 feet. Is means equal, so I know that this equals negative 10. Okay? So now I'm going to find out what h is. What is the actual height of this roller coaster? Undo my addition on both sides. Now I undo my division. I have to do it on both sides. And I'm left with h equals 90 divided by 10 is 9 feet. So what is h? It is 9 feet.